So, welcome everyone. We're very glad that so many of you are able to join us for the program tonight, commemorating the International Holocaust Remembrance Day. My name is Linda Milstein. I'm a member of the Change Board of Directors. I want to start by recognizing that our center, the Center for Holocaust, Human Rights, and Genocide Education, is housed on the occupied territory of the Lenni Lenape people. We want to thank our sponsors and our supporters. We very much appreciate their support for our program tonight. And we're hoping that many of you will consider joining Change as members. If you go to our website, www.change.org, you'll see the different levels of membership. And members are really an important source of support for us for both funding and for connection. Please consider joining. So for housekeeping, the program is being recorded and everyone who's registered will receive a link to the recording and a link to Dr. Withers' website within a week. This evening, when Dr. Withers tells his story, there will be a time for Q&A when he concludes. Please use the chat to put your questions up for us to ask him. I'll be monitoring the chat and I'll get to as many questions as possible in the time that we have. Closed captioning is available. If you want to use it, you'll see a message toward the top of your screen. Please use that to take advantage of the closed captioning option. We'll also be muting everyone for the duration of the program, so we don't want any interruptions during John Withers' presentation, and I know that you'll respect that. We appreciate it. But in order to get a sense of our audience tonight, John and Change would both like you all to participate in a really quick 4-question poll. We're going to put it up on the screen now and ask you to take just a few moments to respond, to answer those 4 questions, and then we'll just see what the results are. Thank you. Okay, so we're going to take a look at the results of the poll. We see that there, quite a few of us are familiar with the Holocaust, 84%, and we have another, I think, 16% that are somewhat familiar with it. And then as far as the Jim Crow laws go, smaller percentage for that. 36% of us say that we're either very familiar with it or somewhat familiar, it'd be 48%. And then for 39% of people have actually stood up at risk to themselves or their career to stand up against someone who's expressed hate speech in some way. And then a whopping 73% of us have actually personally experienced discrimination in our own lives. Thank you so much for participating in that poll. I think whatever level we're at with either the Holocaust or the Jim Crow laws, we're going to learn something new from Dr. Withers tonight. So I'm very happy that we're here to be able to hear his story. Now I'm going to turn over the screen to Howard Dorman, who is the president of our board of directors at Change, and he'll say a few words and introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Linda. Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good evening. Good evening from New Jersey. I'm Howard Dorman, and as Linda mentioned, I am the president of the board of directors at Change, located on the campus of Brookdale Community College in Lincroft, New Jersey. For the past 44 years, Change has carried out its mission to, 1, educate about the Holocaust, genocide, and human rights; 2, promote the elimination of racism, anti-Semitism, and all forms of prejudice; and to develop outstanding creative programs like the one that you're going to see shortly, and activities regarding these crucial human issues. As Linda mentioned, and it's worth saying again, please take a moment after the presentation or tomorrow to visit our website at www.change to learn more about us. The United Nations General Assembly designated January 27th, the anniversary of the liberation of the Auschwitz-Birkenau Killing Center, as International Holocaust Remembrance Day. On this annual day of commemoration, the UN urges every member state to honor the 6 million Jewish victims of the Holocaust and millions of other victims of Nazism. We do thank you for joining us for this important commemoration. A big thank you to the Change team members, Linda Milstein, Dale Daniels, Gabby Higgins, and Susan Yellen, for all of their hard work in making today's program happen. In a moment, you will hear about the lives of 2 Holocaust survivors after liberation. As you can see, I'm sitting in front of 2 of the panels that are part of our permanent exhibit here at Change. No coincidence, gotta figure which shoulder.
Yeah.
That over my shoulder is our mother after liberation. At the time, she was 18 years old. Both of our parents, and my brother is on the Zoom tonight, were Holocaust survivors. Our mom, Ellen, was in multiple camps, including Auschwitz. In mid-January 1945, she was one of tens of thousands of prisoners that were forced to march west from Auschwitz to be denied liberation by the Soviets. Known as the death marches because thousands of victims were killed, my mother miraculously survived and was liberated from the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp in Germany, 520 miles away from Auschwitz. I do want to tell you that one of the many stops along the way that she made on her march was at the Gross-Rosen concentration camp. She had learned during the war that her father might have been a prisoner there. She did get off the cattle car, and she searched for him, but she couldn't find him in the day or the day and a half that she was there. If you roll the calendar forward, in 1996, we received information from the Red Cross. We received an actual death certificate that my grandfather, Pinchas Wiener, was murdered in that camp on March 3rd, 1945, about 40 days before the war was over. As inscribed on the walls behind me, my mother's words as she shared her overwhelming fear and despair at the moment of liberation. Quote, "Then came a realization that there is nobody alive. We only had one thing, that was to live through the war. What's going to be after that? Who cares? We're going to be liberated. And then we were liberated, and then you are alive for nothing. You have no education. You have no background. You have no way of making a living for yourself. You are a pauper spiritually, mentally, and physically. Nobody you knew is alive. We hope you had a chance to read Dr. John Withers' second impressive bio on the intro PowerPoint. It's now my honor to introduce John Withers II, who will share his father's experience with two young survivors. John?
Well, I want to thank you, Howard, Linda, all of the people at Change who have been so wonderful in bringing about this program and in assisting with the remembrance of International Holocaust Remembrance Day. I consider this extremely important. I consider it just another extension of the incredible role that an organization like Change has. As the survivors of the war and of the Holocaust move on, it is left to wonderful people like you to make sure that those events are not forgotten and that the lessons that we take forward into the future are the proper and the correct ones. I would like to tell a story. It's a story that takes place in the context of enormous historical events: World War II, the Holocaust, the Jim Crow era in America. But it focuses on three young men brought together in the most unlikely of circumstances, and how their particular and incredible friendship helped them each and all to negotiate their way against the obstacles that they would have faced throughout their lives. So I want to take you back in time. I want to take you back to the year 1945, to Germany. A few weeks in the spring of 45, after the war in Europe had ended. In all of the chaos of that period, an order came down to a very small quartermaster truck company, 150 men, 50 trucks. And that order was to carry a load of supplies on an emergency basis to a German township with an unpronounceable name. Now, in the World War II period, the American Army was racially segregated. And as it happened, this unit was an all-Black unit, as many of the quartermasters were. And one of its officers was my father, Lieutenant John L. Withers of Greensboro, North Carolina. As I said, it was an emergency order. But the war had ended, and these guys weren't focused on that. All orders seemed to be emergency orders. And in fact, the men had a saying that the Army seemed to expect them to leave immediately, but to arrive even sooner. So they paid little attention to it. Their thoughts were on going home. Their thoughts were returning to their mother's cooking, to their girlfriends, to that innocent life that they had lived prior to the war. And so when they arrived at this town, they were shocked to discover that it was the Dachau concentration camp. The camp had been liberated, a few weeks before, but the conditions there were still horrible. Illnesses and starvation and so many terrible things that these men, even though they had had rough lives throughout, they'd never seen anything like this. They'd never encountered it, and they were horrified and they were shocked. And then a thing happened in that camp that would brand itself upon their memories for the rest of their lives. Once the supplies had been delivered, their orders were to transfer prisoners, former prisoners from the camp by truck to a new facility where the Red Cross and other international organizations could better take care of these people who had suffered so greatly. And as the cavalcade of the people marched through Dachau to reach the trucks, in their rags, in their decrepit position, stumbling on aching legs and weakness, my father and his men realized that they were looking into the face of slavery. Now, they had never seen slavery before, but it was their legacy, the legacy of their people in the United States. And the impact of that event was staggering. My father told of how all of the repressed fears and anxieties and anger that had been inculcated him as a Black American rushed again to the surface. And he looked upon this scene with a kind of horror that he had never before experienced. And it brought one thing home to him. He had fought the war. He had willingly fought the war. He saw Nazism as an evil that must be opposed. But there was an irony in his fighting because the principles upon which the war was supposedly fought did not apply to him. The four freedoms did not apply to him as a Black person from North Carolina. So he was fighting a war, but there was an ambiguity to it until that moment. And at that moment, he realized why he was a soldier in the American army fighting the war. He was fighting for the freedom of people, for the dignity of people. Not only these people climbing aboard the trucks, but his own people and himself. And it was a lesson that he never forgot. The soldiers, many of the soldiers were so upset, they had nightmares. They were depressed. It hung over the camp like a dark, their camp once they had departed Dachau, like a dark cloud. And so they were further shocked when a couple of days thereafter, two young men, clearly from Dachau, still wearing the striped jackets of the concentration camp, appeared at the entrance to these men's encampment. And even though they couldn't speak English, they did everything that they could with sign language and the few words that they had to try to persuade the men to help them, to give them something to do, some little job, some task, any task, washing dishes or taking care of the trucks or cleaning anything, to give them that modicum of earning so that they could pursue their lives. And so the soldiers faced a dilemma. What were they to do? There were many things they could have done. One thing, they just simply could have said, hey, scram, get out of here. Or another, as quartermasters, they had access to the supplies of the American Army. Get a carton of K rations, give it to the kids, point them to the nearest displaced persons camp where there might be the Red Cross or other organizations to help them. And they could have considered that generosity and a task well done. But they didn't. They did something else. They brought the boys into their camp. Now that decision, one could leap to the conclusion that, affected as they were by Dachau, of course they were going to be sympathetic, of course they were going to bring them in. But the reality was much more difficult than that. Because this was a wartime army, and it had prescriptions against bringing non-military people into military housing, or having particularly those kinds of associations with concentration camp victims who carried illnesses, and the effect upon the morale might be very, very great. But beyond that, and the military was harsh in its discipline. It was firm in its discipline. And these men could have gone to the brig, they could have gotten demerits, or more particularly, they could have been dishonorably discharged. And that would have been an extreme difficulty, an extreme problem for these men, because with that on their records, they would have to return to a Jim Crow society. Now, when we speak of Jim Crow, to me, all too often, the portrayal is woefully inadequate. We speak of, we show or present in the films people moving to the back of the bus, people having to drink from a separate water fountain, in some way as though to imply that Jim Crow was a series of individual slights. But it wasn't. Jim Crow was a political, economic, and social structure whose entire intent was to decree that African Americans were inferior to whites. Jim Crow was white supremacy carried out at every level of the society. So in portrayals of Black people, right, they were portrayed as ill-looking, they were portrayed as intellectually inferior, they were portrayed as physically weaker, interestingly enough. They were mocked, they were derided. They were under the threat of economic repression. They could lose their jobs. There was hardly any place to turn, and there was no recourse for them. They could not turn to law enforcement. They could not turn to the courts. There was no political leadership that represented them that could stand up for them. They had to try to survive under this repression with very, very limited ways of responding to it. And the key thing to remember was that this whole Jim Crow system was not an aberration. As early as the mid-19th century, a Chief Justice of the Supreme Court had said that Black people had no rights that a white person must recognize. And later rulings throughout history legitimized this very system. All right, it wasn't an aberration, it was the law of the land. So when these men had to make this decision, and when they decided to bring them in, they had a great deal at stake. Now, when they brought them in, they took one precaution, and that is they didn't tell the officers, including my father, they didn't say what had happened. But when word leaked out that there were 2 Dachau prisoners being hidden in the camp, my father demanded that they be brought before him. He had in his mind that these prisoners from Dachau that were being discussed were grizzled con men, men on the make, men taking advantage of the naivete of my dad's young troops. And so he was caught, he was completely taken aback when the people who appeared before him were 2 young, terrified kids. They looked to be about 16 and about 14. They were actually a little older than that, but malnutrition had taken its toll. They had sores, they were thin, they were pale, and they were absolutely terrified. As one of them later told me, "I don't know what would have happened if your father had sent us away." But he didn't. But he didn't. In his mind, these were the kind of people for which he had fought the war. So in came these young men. Now, they stayed with the soldiers for close to a year. The men nourished them back to health. They clothed them in military outfits. They provided them with shelter, and they incorporated them into the activities and the working of the company itself. So the guys started off working in the kitchen, but soon the men were showing them how to repair a truck, how to drive a Jeep, how to do all of the other things that the soldiers themselves did. And you could see in these kids a bond formed between these men and these 2 young kids that was special and unbreakable. Now, during that time, of course, there needed to be adjustments. All right, one of the first that needed to happen was the kids' names. Right, one of the kids, for example, they were both from Poland, and they had long, complicated Polish names. One of them, for example, was Mieczysław Weichensberg. And as one of the soldiers says, "Lieutenant, didn't they leave a vowel out of there somewhere?" And the soldiers just couldn't handle this. You know, these guys from Georgia and Alabama with their slow Southern drawls couldn't do it. So the older boy, whose name was Shlomo, they figured out that, okay, that's the equivalent of Solomon, so they called him Solomon. The younger one, Mieczysław Weichensberg, they gave up on completely. And they just gave him that old Southern fond nickname, Pee-wee. And so there you had it. 2 latest recruits to the company, Pee-wee and Solomon. The second thing, of course, was language, English. These kids barely spoke a word. Now, being with the soldiers, they began to develop a facility very rapidly, probably out of some kind of survival necessity that they had gained when they were prisoners in the various camps during the war. But the English that they learned, of course, was the soldiers' English. And we know what soldiers' English is like. It's not a hammer. It's a goddamn hammer. And the kids didn't know, so they went over and brought them the goddamn hammer. And it very quickly, they could ripen the air with what they had learned from the soldiers. My dad remembered also that, interestingly enough, he recalls that a little bit of that Southern drawl crept into their pronunciation. The other thing was that these young men had to get used to living with 150 African Americans. They were close to them, they trusted them, they loved them, and so on. But there were just a great many things that they found rather peculiar. Baseball. Baseball made no sense to these kids at all. A round cylinder swatting at a round ball and then racing around in circles, that was not a particular sport to them. They viewed it with absolute amazement. The other thing was that many of the things that the soldiers ate, they were not accustomed to. Collard greens, pork chops. They seem to have no inhibitions about plunging into anything that the guys cooked. And indeed, they plunged in mightily. The word in the company was that if you were in chow line behind these two kids, you were likely to go hungry that night. They just ate, and it was no doubt psychological after the starvation that they had been through. The soldiers also had their own little customs. They liked to preen their hair by putting pomade on it at night and then taking a woman's stocking and tying a knot in it and pulling it down over their heads so that the hair stayed in place. And again, this was all extremely curious to these young men, but they simply did not understand a great deal of what was going on. And so gradually, there developed a kind of a ritual. They found in my father an older man, a more mature man. He was in his late 20s. Most of these others were in their teens or early 20s. And they found him composed and welcoming and willing and patient, willing to take time to try to explain things to them. So in the evenings, once the work in the company was done, they would gravitate to his quarters, and they would ask him these questions to try to make sense of them. And then they would ask him about other things. Was there really a building in the United States that was hundreds of flights tall? Were there really wild Indians in the United States? And gradually this became a little session, a little discussion. Sometimes they told jokes, sometimes they sang songs, but it became a pastime that was commonly followed. But what my father began to learn over time was that there was something more going on here. Now he was not a psychologist or a psychiatrist or anything. But he gradually was able to sense something. One of the things that struck him was that it was impossible to talk about the kid's past. you raised anything, what town are you from? How many in your family, and so on. They would simply burst into tears and raced out of the room. So no one, it was an unwritten rule of the company that no one raised those matters. But on the other hand, the kids wanted to know everything possible about my dad's growing up, and more and more and more about this place that he came from called America. Tell us about America. What is it like in America? And he began to realize that America had a symbolic meaning to them. It was not an America that they knew anything about, just what they saw in the newsreels, but America, America, America. And he realized that they saw it as a place of hope, maybe their last hope, a place that they could start it anew. And in all the discussions and everything they were talking about, what they were doing was seeking from him reasons to believe, reasons why they should trust this thing called life that had treated them so terribly so far in their young lives. How to start again, maybe in America. And he felt that it was his task to say to them, or to convey to them somehow, that although everything so far had been terrible, they were young, they were strong, they were bright, the future yet held hope. And so he talked about America, but he realized he couldn't talk about his America. He couldn't talk about the America the way that he grew up. It was too negative, and that's the last thing that they needed. And so he talked about another America, an America that he believed in, but it was the America yet to come, the America of that day in the future, the America that at some time would live out the true meaning of its creed. And they seem to take heart from this. At the end of the year, the unit began to demobilize. But by that time, the kids were on their feet again. They were healthy. They were humorous. They were confident. And they realized that the change was coming, so they had begun to move to a nearby town, and there they had taken what they had learned from the soldiers to get jobs in a mechanic shop. They got little apartments for themselves. Solomon, the older boy, had met a young woman, also a Holocaust survivor. They were engaged. And so the sprouts of a new life seemed to be taking off. My father left with incredible memories of these two young men. When he left, he wondered, would he ever see them again? Now, I'd like to leap forward a bit. When he returned to the United States, my father felt that he had one chance left to escape Greensboro and the segregation that existed there. And that was the GI Bill. He had read about it, he knew about it, and he was hoping that he could qualify so that he can continue his education, to get a doctorate on that basis, to get a good job, to marry, to have a family, to make something of himself, to be able to go on. And all through the year that they were hiding the boys, he recognized that he simply had to that he was going to take that risk, but also hope that he could qualify, and he did. He ended up meeting and marrying a young woman from nearby High Point, North Carolina. He went to the University of Chicago and over a great many years earned his doctorate. I came along a couple of years later, my brother came along, and he sought professionally a career in the American Foreign Service. So much of my early life and much of his professional life were in countries overseas. He was one of the early pioneers of African Americans in the diplomatic corps, and he succeeded. He succeeded quite well there. Living overseas during those times, our first posting was in 1958, Vientiane, Laos. There's nothing like television, hardly any radio, any of this kind of thing. So the primary entertainment of people at that time was telling stories. And my father was a wonderful storyteller. And as kids, my brother and I loved his war stories, the adventure ones, the times that they were strafed or the times they were caught between the lines. We loved that kind of story. And we would have argued that my dad single-handedly had won the war. But the story that he always came back to was a different one, and it was one that we initially did not understand. And it was something about these two kids, and they were white, and they were with the company. What was that all about? There was no action and there was no drama, but he came back to it again and again and again. And he always concluded that story with the question, will I ever see them again? Let us leap forward 40 years. My dad was retired, and he was struck down with cancer. He changed once that occurred. He was no longer this gregarious, funny, outgoing individual that he had been. He was inward looking. He was depressed. And I said to my mother, what in the world is going on here? Why are we facing all of this? And she said, your father is elderly now. And he's encountered his mortality, and he's trying to look back and add up the summation of his life. He wants to know if he had been a good man. And I said, he's been a wonderful man. Everybody likes him. Why don't we just tell him? And she said, no, you can't tell him. You have got to show him. And it was from that conversation that in time, it occurred to me that maybe the way to show him was if I could find some of his soldiers and take his favorite story and provide the historicity of it, then he could see factually all of the things that he had done. And so I began to search. And I searched initially for the soldiers, but eventually, inevitably, I began looking for the two young men. Now, it was quite a search. It was difficult because I only had one main piece of historical evidence, and that was this postcard. And this postcard is of Pee Wee, dressed in his army uniform. And on the back is a bit of information. You really can't see it, but the important piece of information there was his name, his full name. And so I began to search for Mieczysław Wajchenschberg. I'm not going to go into all of the different elements of it, but let us just say it was an onerous search. And it was full of disappointments. It was full of dead ends. It was full of misinformation. And I often went down these roads that that really led to nowhere. But slowly, every so often, a little piece of information would come. And I finally found out through research at our US Holocaust Museum and with Yad Vashem, his hometown, Starachowice, Poland. And once I'd found his hometown, I could look for things connected to it, and I found a survivors organization. And within that survivors organization was a wonderful man, Howard Chandler. It was his anglicized name. And I was able to get in touch with Chandler, and he was intrigued that I was looking, for Mieczyslaw. And it turned out that he'd been a playmate of Mieczysław's when they were young, and that he had seen Mieczyslaw at a gathering of the Starachowice survivors not that long ago. And he said to me, first of all, you need to know who you're really looking for now. All right? He's no longer Mieczysław Eichenberg. He is Martin Wiegen. And he's lived here in the United States, in the state of Connecticut. That's who you're looking for. And he scurried around a little bit and he said, here's his phone number. I called, and the only moment of true despair I had in all of this search was the fact that the phone rang discontinued service. And in all of these years, I mean, we're talking about 10 years, 5 to 10 years of this. All I could think was, it's discontinued because he's passed away and I've missed him. But Chandler wouldn't let me get discouraged. He said, look, no. We're going to stick with this. Well, I lived close to my parents at the time. I went over after that disappointment. I told them, I said, look, I don't think I can do this. I don't think I can find him. And I left to go back to, to my own place. Apparently, as soon as I'd been out the door, my father said to my mother, one day John is going to call and say he's found Pee-wee. Well, I get back home and I'm still looking in these different places for more information, and the telephone rings. And I pick it up, and it's a woman's voice on the line, and she's asking for somebody named Wickers. And I said to her, oh, I'm afraid you have the wrong number. My name is John Withers. I think you're looking for somebody else. And she said, well, hold on a second. She said, I got a call from a man named Howard Chandler. And he said that you're looking for a relative of mine. And I said, okay. But in my mind, I'm thinking, if she's calling, it's because he can't. I've missed him. No, she said. I'm his daughter. He's sitting right here. I just want your permission, because he's a little hard of hearing, to stay on the line to help communication. And she handed the phone over. And at that moment, the boy who had once been Mieczysław Eichenberg, the man, Martin Wiegen, and a lost soul named Pee-wee came on the line. And he said, did you say your name was John Withers? And I said, yes. And he said, are you related to John L. Withers, Lieutenant John L. Withers of Greensboro, North Carolina? And I said, yes, he's my father. How is your father? I saw him this morning. He's fine. Will you tell him that I'm fine too? I was shaking when I got off of the phone. The last thing I had done was to say to him, give me all of your contact information. I need to know how to get in touch with you. And it turned out that the phone number that I had called was in fact the right number, but the state of Connecticut, for whatever its reasons, had created a second area code. And that's why I had missed him. I called my parents and I said, leave the phone line clear. Dad, don't talk to the guys about baseball. Mom, don't talk to your sister. Leave the line clear. And that evening, for the first time in 50 years, my father and Pee Wee linked up again. 3 weeks later, which just happened to turn out to be almost 55 years from the liberation date of Dachau, they were together again in Hartford, Connecticut. And it was as though a day had not passed. Picture of the reunion there. They picked up from exactly where they left off. And that bond of friendship was so tight that it remained for the rest of their lives. Pee Wee passed away a couple of years later, but for that period of time, that friendship renewed. It also allowed me to search for Solomon. Somehow I only had one name for Solomon, and I didn't know whether it was last name, first name. It was impossible to search for him. But Pee Wee knew where he was. And I was able to contact his family and discover that Solomon had, in point of fact, passed away a number of years earlier. But I spoke to his wife and asked her if she knew anything at all about Solomon's ties with the African American soldiers. And she said yes. And she said yes. And let me read to you what she wrote me in a letter to show you how, after all of those years, what had really, what remained. And she wrote that Solomon spoke a great deal about the American soldier who used to tease him as being big-headed and showed him the beautiful side of mankind. Her husband, she said, never talked about the terrible experiences of the Nazi era. He mainly spoke of the American soldier, his good heart, and how he helped him to regain hope in life and mankind. Pee Wee himself had very strong memories. And one of the memories that he had was of the Black soldiers, not just my father, but the soldiers themselves. And what he told us was, what he said was, some of the guys were so poor, they didn't have real homes. They just lived in shacks. Those soldiers were like our family. They protected us, included us in everything. Some of them had never seen anything in life, never had anything, but they gave us more than they had. Let me just add, by way of conclusion, just a thought or two that come to me when I give this talk. The question that comes to me is, what is the measure of a human being? Right? Is it fame? Is it wealth? Is it power? Or is it something quieter, humbler, simpler? Something that comes from within. Solomon Pee Wee and Lieutenant John were, by some measure, as different as they could be. Right? Their race, their creed, their cultural experiences, on the surface so far separated. But they had one thing in common. They had the ability to look into the face of another person and see the humanity there. And in seeing that humanity, they were able to generate a humanity of their own that took its expression in compassion and understanding. So when I tell this story, I take comfort in the fact that humans, that people like Solomon Pee-wee and Lieutenant John were once among us. And I take hope from my belief that people like them are with us still. So, thank you. We can, I think there are some slides. Perhaps we could have, yeah, these are slides of that wonderful reunion that I had. The first one was the moment that my dad and Pee-wee met after a separation of 55 years. This is these are the extended families. The gentleman holding the young lad in his lap is Pee-wee. Next to him is my dad. Next to my dad is Pee-wee's wife. Immediately behind her is my mother, then me, then Mary Ruth. And next to Mary Ruth in the pink blouse is Barbara, Pee-wee's daughter, the one who made that historic phone call. And kneeling in front of Barbara is Ed, Pee-wee's son. So I think there's a next. Okay. I suppose if there are, if there are any questions, maybe we could begin with those. I'll be happy to try to answer. Wait, Linda, I can't hear you.
Sorry, I thought I had unmuted. I guess I muted. But thank you so much for your story and that sort of amazing story of both the understanding of the soldiers of what they were confronting, your father's compassion, and the ability of these two young men also to respond in a way that allowed all of them to have this experience of understanding and coming together, in this joint effort to save these two men and reestablish them in lives where they can move forward after all of their experiences. Thank you, and thank you for amplifying our understanding of the Holocaust in a different way, and the Jim Crow laws as well.
It's been my privilege.
So we looking at for questions in the chat and encouraging people to put them in. I wondered if I'll start by saying that when Pee-wee and your father were reunited and they shared, I'm sure they did a lot of catching up of their stories over the years. At that time, was there any discussion of what your father had experienced growing up as a Black person in this country, or what Pee-wee might have understood having lived here for so many years?
Actually, yes. I mean, at the time of the reunion, it was a very different situation. Pee Wee had come here. He'd been very successful as a businessman. He was quite well to do, and so he wasn't the vulnerable youngster. And so they talked very openly. One of the things that was not surprising, but remarkable to us, and that is when Pee Wee passed away, and we went to his memorial service. The audience resembled a small United Nations. All right, in his business, he had hired Jamaicans and Cambodians and African Americans and white Americans, you name it, and all of them were there to pay tribute to them. And I think that Barbara felt that that in some way this stemmed from the friendship and admiration that he had for his old marching buddies in the truck company.
Did they see, as you so beautifully described to us, the parallels or the similarities in the experience of Pee Wee in the camps and your father's stories and his family of slavery?
No, that was a bit more complicated. All right. Like so many Holocaust survivors, indeed survivors of trauma, he did not speak. He had not spoken in all those years about his time in the camps. And his children were desperate to know. I mean, they wanted to understand, but he couldn't. He simply couldn't. But what happened was that once he met my father again, and they were together again, he began to open up and he began to talk. Now, sometimes he couldn't bring himself to talk directly to his own children. So he would talk through surrogates, me, my wife, to a degree, my dad, and then we could convey what he had told us. I mean, one of the most amazing things was that when we were on that first telephone call, when Barbara had called me that first day out of the blue, she was hearing the beginnings of the story for the very first time in her life. She did not know that he had been resident with a Black Army company. She did not know that he'd had a nickname, Pee Wee. She had no idea who he was talking about, Lieutenant Withers in Greensboro, North Carolina. So all of this in that new environment, came up. But I think my dad's view on it, and I think I'm giving it to you accurately. He understood prejudice. He understood the prejudice that he had endured, and he certainly understood, at least to a degree, what Pee Wee and Solomon had been through in the anti-Semitism of Poland in the pre-war years. But he placed the Holocaust in its own special category. This was something that he had never encountered, and that went beyond anything that even he believed that racism and anti-Semitism would lead to. He always made that differentiation.
So in affirming for your father his worthiness as a human being, you also provided for Pee Wee's family a legacy of the history of their father.
It
Wow.
was, again, we were bumbling into a lot of this. All right. We didn't know that his kids didn't know. All right. So we were just there, and but in the initial meetings, that we had with people, because we went up to Hartford at least a couple of times. What he would do would be, while his family was with my dad and with my mom in one location, he would draw me aside and he would talk to me.
Mm.
And then at a certain point, he would say, "Oh, let me go see your dad again." And at that point, his kids would come in and I would relate what he had just told me. And I think that at a certain time, it was kind of I don't want to call it a test, but it was an observation. All right. I think that one of the difficulties that he had in talking about this was that he couldn't afford to try to relate this great trauma in his life to people who either could not or would not understand it. He needed to talk to people who knew something, not a lot, but something about the Holocaust, but certainly took it as seriously as we possibly could. I don't know if I'm explaining that properly, but Howard read that incredible statement of his mother's at the time of liberation, and I feel it is just the most powerful thing about the kind of emptiness that is suddenly there when liberation comes. And that was certainly what Pee Wee felt. But oftentimes, I think he kind of worried about understanding. People would talk to him about, how did you sustain hope in the camp? And he would try to explain to them, there was no hope in the camp. You didn't hope, you survived.
Mm.
And you didn't survive in some kind of broad sense, you survived that day. And I think that he recognized that, or he felt that was a point that I understood.
Mm.
And I think that's where he was able to open up a little bit. And then pretty soon he decided that his story had to be told. So he conveyed the whole thing.
But did he record it? Do you know? Was it either documented or?
Yes.
Mhm.
Yes. He an article on this whole story appeared in the Wall Street Journal back in 2003. And he was reluctant at first, called me and said, would you, what do you think? I said I would do it. And so he did, and his son recorded that. Now, during the first meeting, there were video cameras and all kinds of cameras everywhere. And so there are various tapes of, not in a comprehensive way, just dinner table conversation, but in which he talked a great deal about this. So there is some recorded evidence.
Well, thank you again, John, for sharing your story with us. It's just remarkable, and from the comments in the chat, very much touched the hearts of many people on the program tonight, and I'm sure that will be true of people who watch the recording as well. I want to remind people that John's book, A Balm in Gilead is available, and those people who are supporters and sponsors of the program are entitled to that book. We have them waiting, copies waiting for them at the Change office. But if you'd like to order the book, please call Change at 732-224-1889. That's 732-224-1889. And we'd be glad to talk to you about getting a copy for you. So
Linda,
thank you.
can I just add
Yes.
one last quick thing?
Sure,
And that
please.
is, if there were other questions that you didn't have time to get to, and you want to send them to me, I'll be happy to try to provide the people with answers.
Okay, thank you for, that's also very much appreciated. So thank you everyone for attending. Very happy to have you be here and share this wonderful evening with us. And just say good night.